The views and opinions expressed in the following podcast do not necessarily reflect those of the producers, the affiliates, or digital platforms hosting this podcast. All content is for the purposes of education, conjecture, and at times entertainment. We promote inclusiveness and diversity. Enjoy the show.
Welcome to Into the Deep with Jay Costa.
Welcome to Into the Deep. I'm Jay Costa. I am humbled and honored to host today's guest. He's a best-selling author of yoga science and, in my opinion, a modern conduit to our world's most ancient wisdom and mental health traditions. Today's guest is Leonard Perlmutter. He's the founder of the American Meditation Institute and for decades has served on the faculty of the New England Institute of Ayurvedic Medicine. Leonard, also known as Ram Lev, is a direct disciple of Swami Rama, the man who, in laboratory conditions, demonstrated that blood pressure, heart rate, and the autonomic nervous system can be voluntarily controlled. We talk about Leonard's newest book, Your Conscience, and his inspiration behind sharing the knowledge to unlocking the limitless wisdom and creativity within each of us. We also discuss what Leonard frames as the 4 functions of the mind to help us parent our ego, our senses, and our unconscious mind so that our conscience can become our trusted guide. So, join me as we seek light and journey into the deep with Leonard Perlmutter, Ram Lev. Enjoy. Leonard, thank you so much for joining us on Into the Deep. I sincerely can't thank you enough for doing this for us.
Well, I appreciate the invitation for sure.
Absolutely. For those who are tuning in and listening to this or even watching this, can you share with us who you are? What is it you do? Loaded question.
Well, I guess I could reply on many different levels, Jay. But I assume that you're talking about the mind-body-sense complex, so I don't want to shock anybody with the first answer. My earliest philosophical memory was when I was a little child, and philosophy seems to have guided me throughout my whole life. Philosophy and practicality, though those 2 pillars seem to have directed my life. And when I was in grade school and then in high school, I was motivated by that love of philosophy and practicality, and I joined the Scouts. And I had a conversation with my scoutmaster once, and I reminded him, not that he needed reminding, but I reminded him that the Scout motto was "Be prepared." So I said, "What should we be prepared for?" And he looked at me with a strange look in his eye, and he said, "How would I know?" And so everybody needs a philosophy of life. But nobody has, in our educational system, ever thought to teach kids, young students, young minds, impressionable minds, that it's essential. It's a dire necessity that each of us cultivates a philosophy of life that enables us to deal with, whatever life is going to bring to us. And I don't think anybody could have imagined the situation that humanity is in right now with this pandemic and the political contention that seems to be everywhere, wall to wall. But yet, here we are, living in the future and dealing with all these things. So it's always good to have a philosophy of life to guide you. And it should be something that's practical, down to earth, that provides you reliable tools that can be used for every situation.
Absolutely agree with that. 100%. So when you were younger, you just had this compass that you didn't realize you had, that you were just following that whole time.
That's right. It was a scent, Jay. It was something that, and that's the closest thing that I could think of. It was a feeling or something that I could actually smell. And when circumstances brought me certain kinds of relationships, I would recognize that aroma. Oh, this is important. This is something that I need to wake up and pay attention to. And I was about 5 years old. Not sure exactly how old I was, so I was probably a little younger than 5. And the family summered in around a small lake in upstate New York, Lake Luzerne. And we had an extended family. My mother's dad and his sons were also there, so it was sort of a multi-family bungalow. And I was up before the crack of dawn. I was always an early riser. And the only other person that was in the cabin with us at the time that was up early was my grandfather, my mother's father. So as soon as I woke up, I would make a mad dash down to my grandfather. I called him Papa. I went down to Papa's room, and virtually every time that I entered, he was praying. It was still dark out. This was in the summertime. And so it was wonderful. I would just sit there and listen to him pray, watch him pray. But one time, something caught my eye. And what was it? It was a glass of water that contained my grandfather's false teeth, which was placed on the nightstand next to his bed. It was the first time that I had seen that, and I had been there numerous times. So I saw it, and then my eye went back and forth between the glass and my grandfather praying, and back and forth and back and forth. And finally, the little child in me said to my grandfather, "Papa, why didn't you put your teeth in?" And he looked at me with a penetrating look, and he called me Lenny. He said, "Lenny, first you pray, then you put your teeth in." So that little child got that message. It was part of that scent. Oh, there are priorities in life that we need and I didn't know enough to say a philosophy of life. I didn't even know what a philosophy of life was at that time. But I knew that there were higher priorities and lower priorities. And we need to recognize them and honor them in real time. So that was a very important teaching for me, a spiritual teaching. So as I grew up and I began to read about different traditions, I was attracted to different philosophies, and I would just dive deeply into them. But unless I could find a practical application for that philosophy, it was not worthy of my energy. I just knew this intuitively. I was not interested in collecting charms of esoterica. I was interested in something that was going to help me deal with whatever it was that might be challenging me. So that led eventually to my study of the perennial philosophy, and that brought me to yoga science. And with yoga science, which is older than recorded history, over 6,000 years old, it was the origin of every single religion. And I know that because I studied different religions, and I could peel back certain aspects of different religions that were sort of man-made, human-made. So personalities, political considerations, economic considerations, cultural influences. I would just peel them away. I'm looking for the kernel. I'm looking for the truth. And every time I got to that kernel, gosh, I say to myself, this is yoga. This is yoga. This is yoga. And sure enough, every great preceptor of every religion was really a yogi. Jesus, for example, he never heard of Christianity. He was born, he died a Jew, but he really just was interested in the rabbis, getting things correct, as opposed to just leaning on political considerations all the time, or this kind of consideration. And so yoga has been my go-to philosophy and science now in earnest for about 50 years. And it's been the greatest blessing in my life. It's changed my life. I would never imagine as a 14-year-old, 13-year-old young boy that I would be sitting here speaking to you about such matters. To that mind of 13 and 14-year-old child, it would have been strange, possibly weird for me to be in this role, so to speak. And yet it all happened very organically and quite naturally. I don't regret any decision that I made. And I tell people, and I mean this, that if I still operated with the same software package, the same mental software package I had when I was 13 or 14, and we all know 13 or 14, that's really the crown of creation, isn't it? That's when we knew everything about everything. It was such a bubble. But if I still had that software today, one of two things would be true. Either I would be really sick, or I would have left the planet a while ago because of illness. But I feel healthier and stronger and more energetic than I ever have. So it's doing something for me so that I can be in service to the truth that it reveals to me. And so I guess you ask, well, who am I? I'm just a human being who is dedicated to serving as best I can. I guess I could say that I'm a modern day Johnny Appleseed. I'm a seed planter. I have no expectations. I have no agenda other than just to plant seeds, or things that have worked for me, that have made me feel better physically, mentally, emotionally, and spiritually. And I tell people straight out, I have no desire for them to believe a word I say. In fact, I warn people not to become dependent on anything I say, because it's from their perspective, they should consider it hearsay, not reliable. Then I say to them, if you're interested in anything that you've heard, I would support you in your effort to experiment with it, to experience the truth for yourself. Then you'll own it. Then you won't be dependent on me or anybody else outside or anything outside. You will become self-reliant. And you will become a responsible human being, because you will be able to respond. You will be able to respond. And that's what responsibility means, the ability to respond. The more that you serve that inner wisdom that comes through your experiments with the truth, you'll be able to respond in a much more skillful way. You'll know what's to be done, when it's to be done, and you'll also know what's not to be done, when it's not to be done.
I couldn't agree more. Wow. That was beautiful, Leonard. You said you started around 13 or 14. What led you to yoga science? What was that spark, that catalyst that got you into yoga science?
Stomach aches.
Really?
Yeah, stomach aches. Pain. Pain is a very interesting messenger. It's I consider it today the shadow of the outstretched hand of the Supreme Intelligence, tapping us on the shoulder and asking us to make a mid-course correction. Evidently, there's some kind of inner conflict going on that is expressing itself in the body or in interpersonal relationships in the form of pain. So it's like a warning system. Mm-hmm. It's somewhat analogous to the GPS that many people have, that equipment in their automobile when they're driving from point A to point B and they've never been to that location before. They don't know how to get there necessarily. So they put the information into their GPS equipment in the automobile, and you get directions to turn here, to turn there. But if we, while driving, we accidentally make a mistake, we hear that voice from the artificial intelligence saying what to us? Recalculating. So I often think of Neil Armstrong. Gosh, first human being on the moon. And I saw a replica of that lunar module in Washington at the Space and Air Museum. And gosh, it was like a large trash can. It was very, very small, put together with gaffer tape. And he was inside this lunar module, hurtling down to the surface of the moon from the mothership at great speed. And onboard computers were reading all sorts of information, all sorts of telemetry, and then radioing them back to Houston, to the Space Center, where they ran through these supercomputers. And then once they went through all that telemetry, went through the supercomputers, and this was in, practically instantaneously, they would then radio back to Armstrong a sequence for him to fire his retro rockets fire this retro rocket for a quarter of a second, this retro rocket for a half a second, so that he could make a soft landing. So when we begin to tune into our own conscience, which is the only function of the mind that can go outside of this matrix in which we find ourselves, this mind, body, sense complex matrix. The conscience alone has the ability, like a mirror, to reflect perfect wisdom, superconscious wisdom, from the superconscious portion of the mind, which resides at the core of our being, what religionists refer to as our soul. So within the soul, which is consciousness, exists an intuitive library of wisdom, the superconscious portion of the mind. So it's beyond the conscious portion, it's beyond the unconscious, but it is the same portion of the mind where Albert Einstein saw mathematical equations, and where Paul McCartney quite regularly hears beautiful melodies. Doesn't mean that I'm going to become a songwriter, or it doesn't mean, Jay, that you're going to necessarily automatically become a physicist. But the more that we listen to the conscience and attempt to parent and train the other functions of the mind, namely the ego, the senses, and the unconscious mind, which only have limited, often faulty perspectives, the more that we can train them to be quiet, the conscience can reliably reflect superconscious wisdom into our conscious mind. And what that tells us is the appropriate thought to think, word to speak, and action to take that will enable each of us to fulfill the purpose of life without pain.
Gosh, so well articulated. When we think of conscience, and we think of when we grow up, from when we were younger through teenage years, and this conscience, right? You feel like it's like a breath where it's changing and adapting, or do you feel that that conscience is static? Like, do you think it's
well, now the conscience is part of the hardware, and so it's like a TV or the internet. So I'm seeing you in pretty much real time, but you're not inside my computer. But there's a signal coming from somewhere else.
Right.
That's interpreted through this hardware and the software that runs the hardware. So the conscience is part of the hardware software that receives the signal. It's the only portion of the mind that has that capacity, because the other aspects of the mind, namely the ego, the senses, and the unconscious mind, they cannot make a decision. They can only advise. So they become lobbyists. Now, they're really good at what they do because they're loud and they're pushy and they're insistent, even though they're often wrong. And that's where we get in trouble. That's where we experience pain, because most human beings are just skimming the surface of consciousness, really sort of like sleepwalking. And what does that mean? It means that autopilot kicks in, and 95% of autopilot, namely the unconscious mind, is directed by the reptilian brain. So the reptilian brain, and therefore the ego, both have this intense fear of annihilation and lack of control, because both think always that the sky is falling, the sky is falling, the sky is falling. and they don't want to die. Well, nobody wants to die. But at a certain point, you come to realize that even though I have a body which is subject to birth, death, decay, and decomposition, and it's my instrument for action on this plane, I am not the body. So it does beg the question, then, who am I? And I think that was your first question. So that's something that people have been asking themselves, I guess, from the beginning of the appearance of the human being on the planet. Who am I? From where have I come? Why am I here? What's to be done? And where will I go when this body is no more? These are questions that begged for some kind of practical, philosophical answer.
And that's where a lot of these teachings, passed even through the Vedic texts and
That's
going
right.
into everything that we already were scratching the surface on. It's just
Right.
Now, your newest book, Your Conscience, you talk
Yes.
about the 4 functions of the mind, and we just kind of dabbled into that in just a few moments. Could you elaborate on the 4 functions of the mind? Because I just love how you articulate it. And it's just a perfect, in my opinion, it's a perfect picture, the way you set it up as the quadrants and those spokes. Would you care to elaborate, Leonard?
Sure. First, we have to start with the recognition and the observation that the body itself cannot take an action without first entertaining a thought. I can't even raise my hand. I can't speak a word without first entertaining a thought, whether I'm consciously aware of it or not. The mind moves first. The body follows. So that places tremendous importance on the mind and our thoughts. So there are 4 functions of the mind that move before the body becomes animated. And of course, whenever we take an action of any form, whether it's thinking, speaking, or acting physically in the world, it always develops a consequence, doesn't it? That became Newton's 3rd law of motion. He received that from the law of karma. And that simply states that thoughts lead to action, and action leads to consequences. So I'm certain that everybody shares pretty much the same desire for the same consequence in every relationship. And what is that? No matter how we define it, everybody wants to be happy.
Mm-hmm.
Everybody wants to be secure. Everybody wants a healthy body and mind. But we don't have a business plan to get to point B from point A. But if we understand the mind and how it operates, that can be part of our philosophy of life. And it's a scientific, philosophical template, if you will. So there are 4 functions of the mind. As I mentioned earlier, only one of them can make a decision. And that was really a profound realization when I learned that. Only the conscience can make a decision concerning what's to be done and what's not to be done. That means that every single choice you and I have made, and every human being in the world, in the history of the world, every action that has ever been made or ever will be made, has been and always will be made by the conscience, because it is the only decision maker. So that leaves the ego, senses, and unconscious mind as advisors. So they go out into the material world to gather information about potential relationships, ideally that will bring us health, happiness, and security. Of course, we learn pretty quickly, if we're awake, that there's no object and there's no relationship in the material world that has any power to make us happy. nor to make us secure, right? We might think that if I purchase certain stocks, certain securities, and the stock market goes up, I say, oh, well, this is making me secure. Well, what happens when there's a bear market and the securities go down? Then that security evaporates into insecurity. But we want long-lasting security, right? And happiness.
Right.
So the ego, for example, which I mentioned seems to be hardwired to the reptilian brain, always insinuates itself into every relationship. And I think of the ego as always carrying a chainsaw on its hip. And whenever there's a relationship that requires an action that brings about a consequence, the ego cuts it in half and says, oh, this portion over here, this is very pleasant. I like it. I think this is good. Let's reprise this. Over here now, this is unpleasant. I consider this bad. I dislike it. Let's eliminate it. So you can see the myopic perspective that the ego has. Because that which, and we already know this from our own personal experience, that which appears as pleasant is not always good for us. And that which appears as unpleasant isn't always bad for us. So if we throw in exclusively 100% with the limited perspective of the ego, we're going to experience pain. Well, we're in pain. So it stands to reason that part of that pain is caused by the fact that we've been listening and following the suggestions of the ego without examining those suggestions consciously with discrimination. So that's the ego, often wrong, but never in doubt. And that doesn't mean that the ego is wrong all the time. My gosh, if we didn't have a healthy ego, we would not be able to drive an automobile or a truck. We would not be able to have this conversation in an intelligent, sort of intelligent way. So the ego is not always wrong. Neither is it always right. So how do we know? Well, we have to vet it. We have to examine and see what the truth is. So that's the ego. Then we have the senses. The senses, oh, they waste a tremendous amount of our creative energy. It's, our creative energy goes through the senses. So we look, we smell, we taste, we listen, and we touch, or we desire to do so, to find out about this world and what's going to make me happy and what's going to bring me security and health. So my experience is the senses, they're not malicious, but they're quite nearsighted, and they can only see the front.
Right.
And they're always looking for pleasure.
Yeah.
Always looking for pleasure. But they never look at the back of the pleasure, where very often there's pain. There are these pairs of opposites. When we look for pleasure, you also get the pain. And in the absence of one, the other appears. So we have to parent the senses. We have to train the senses to present their suggestions, because they're not always wrong. I mean, we have a body, we have senses, life is to be enjoyed. Everybody enjoys a fine meal, an exquisite dessert, a wonderful movie. So we're not out to get rid of the senses. We just want to train them a little better so that they don't spend our creative energy chasing all of these fictitious rainbows that are supposed to have a pot of gold at the end of it. So that's the senses. And then the unconscious mind, of course, this is our software package. This is everything that we deem essential to self-preservation, our memories, our imagination. All these things that we deem essential to self-preservation is stored in the software of the mind, the unconscious mind. And much of what is stored are faulty concepts. They're faulty concepts. We have a lot of faulty concepts stored in the unconscious mind, and the unconscious mind is 1,000,000 times more powerful than good intention. So we're sort of starting from behind the 8 ball. 1,000,000 times more powerful than good intention is this software package. That's why we live in our habit patterns. That's why we think the same things. We say the same things. We do the same things. Oh, we wish that different results would happen, but we keep on working to reinforce what is. And what is pain. We're in a whole lot of hurt. And if you don't believe that, take a minute and check out the nightly news or your daily newspaper or the internet, and you'll see things are really crazy. So the conscience is the only function of the mind that can discriminate, determine, judge, and decide. It's the decision maker. But when the ego senses and unconscious mind are so certain and so loud and so pushy, they create a tremendous amount of noise in the mind. And there's no question about it. For most of humanity, the mind is really noisy. Really noisy. And when there's so much noise in the mind, the conscience cannot hear the signal from the superconscious portion of the mind. Can't do it. I mean, this is a traditional issue for engineers. How can I accentuate the signal when it cannot be increased through all this noise? And so what engineers do is they learn to reduce the noise. That's what we need to do. We need to reduce the noise coming from the ego, senses, and unconscious mind. That doesn't mean that we reject their suggestions out of hand. We must welcome them. We must love them. They are really part and parcel of us. That would be like hating ourselves. No, they are part of us. We want to welcome them because they can be very helpful sometimes. So we love them. So we give them the floor. Please share your perspective. When that perspective is shared, then we need to train and parent them to quiet down. And when we can do that through experimenting, not with forcing them, just experimenting so that the ego, senses, and unconscious mind will have pleasant experiences without feeling that they've died or that there's a threat. So if we can train them to calm down after they give their perspective quietly, then the conscience can work its magic, so to speak, can reflect perfect wisdom from the superconscious portion of the mind at the center of consciousness. That will tell us the thought to think, the word to speak, and the action to take. That will lead us for our highest and greatest good. Then we, now the parent, have to convince the ego, senses, and unconscious mind to support the wisdom that has been reflected by the conscience. That's why we don't take on too much too soon. Start with seemingly insignificant no-brainers.
Mm.
And let the ego, senses, and unconscious mind have a pleasant experience, just like we will have a pleasant experience. And then we can gain their trust, and they can gain the trust of the conscience, that the conscience is not out to get them or to steal their control or their little pleasures. And that's the work of life, is to serve, to be of service to that wisdom, to be of service to coordinating the functions of the mind, training and parenting the ego, senses, and unconscious mind so that the conscience can become our trusted guide, because it alone can reflect the superconscious wisdom that will lead us to the summum bonum, the highest good of all life. So I thought that this was worthy enough to write a book about while I was in quarantine in 2020 with the COVID. And what I decided to write about was just this, about the conscience and the four functions of the mind, because I looked around and I saw people are in terrible, terrible pain. And they feel that they don't have the answers to all of life's challenges. But they do have the answers. But if we don't learn a new dance step, we're not going to be able to find those solutions. You can't keep on dancing the same routine.
Definitely can't. And very well put. I love that analogy. It reminds me of, nothing changes if nothing changes. When we think about how our senses are taking in additional noise and just ramping up the noise that we already have going on within our own minds. And to your point earlier, talking about even just looking at the evening news or maybe scrolling through social media with the constant distractions and, the different agendas that multiple and a myriad of people are, whether it's to try and whatever, that additional noise and not quieting the mind, it's virtually impossible, which is why I know your work is so important right now more than ever, if I may be so bold to say.
Well, I'm concerned for humanity, because in this condition where we're being bombarded by all this information and all this stimulus, where things are changing so quickly, things that would take 1,000 years to change in nanoseconds. It literally, it's really unbelievable living here in the future. And what's the reaction from the reptilian brain? Fear and anger and wanting to hide out and look for a stallion who will provide security. Because let's face it, we have to start with the equipment that we have. We have an animal body, but unlike every other animal, we also have part of our hardware that can reflect superconscious wisdom, which is outside the matrix. So we do not have to live our lives as animals. We can use the human experience to go beyond the animal, to unite with the divine, if that's our desire.
Right.
So people just do what they want to do.
Yeah. It's so true. And there's a quote of yours that I absolutely love. When the mind relies on faulty concepts, even a successful human being is condemned to acting in the world like an automobile that can turn in only one direction. Collisions and destruction are inevitable. it's just so perfect.
Well, that's the way it is. That's the way it is. And so when the metal, so to speak, is ready for the maker, we'll start to wake up. And we'll begin to, instead of continually looking outside of ourselves for the answer, we'll go within. We'll seek within. And when we begin that process, we will definitely find the truth within. And that's the truth that will set us free and provide us the solutions to all of life's challenges.
Absolutely. Why do you think it's so difficult for individuals? This is hard because it's loaded. It's gosh, where to go? This is just me from wherever it's coming asking. So
that's right. I understand.
And
I'm with you.
why is it so challenging? And I feel like most humans in most society, we choose traditions versus truth more often than not. But why is it so difficult for humans, or just as a species, to try and better our own selves, to make ourselves better versions of ourselves, so that we can in turn make our environment and our world a better place for not just ourselves, but for our neighbors and for fellow humanity?
Well, I do believe that every human being is trying to do that to the best of their ability. I do believe that.
Mm-hmm.
The challenge is faulty concepts that exist in the unconscious mind. Mm-hmm. So it's not the world that causes us pain, it's what we think about it. And our perceptions are skewed by our conceptions. Our perceptions are skewed by our conceptions. So we see what we know. Mm. So there's a marvelous teaching story. I love baseball. Baseball is a very philosophical game as far as I'm concerned. It's a very yogic game.
Right on.
And there was an occasion where 3 umpires were having dinner together. And they were talking shop during dinner. And they were talking about what constitutes a ball and what constitutes a strike. Hmm. And so the first umpire, who was a rookie, never called balls and strikes in the major leagues. He was in the minor leagues, but not the major leagues. He said, "I call them as I see them." Oh, and the other 2, nod. Okay, he calls them as he sees them. And the second umpire, who was calling balls and strikes in the major leagues for about 10 years, says, "I call them as they are." Oh, he calls them as they are. And the third umpire in the conversation, he's an old pro. He's been calling balls and strikes for over 25 years in the bigs. He looks at the other 2 after he hears what they have to say, and he says to them, "They are what I call them." Our perceptions are skewed by our conceptions. That's why Shakespeare says there's nothing either good or bad. Just thinking makes it so. So that sort of speaks to your question, Jay. We have these faulty concepts. Just like I have these correcting lenses so that I can see clearer.
Right.
But what if the lenses were clouded and gave a very poor understanding of what reality was? And to be honest with you, I'm not even aware that I'm looking through these lenses, but I am, and they're coloring everything that I am perceiving.
Right.
So I think that's the human condition. I think of from St. Thomas, a quote by Jesus. I took my stand in the midst of the world, and in flesh I appeared to them, and I did not find any of them interested, for they came into the world empty, and they also seek to depart from the world empty. Gosh, it just tugs at my heart. And this is over 2,000 years ago, speaking about the human condition. So yeah, we're modern, thoroughly modern, but have we made any advancements? Are we any more happy? Are we any more secure? Are we any more healthy?
Wow. It's just as relevant today
Yeah.
as it ever was.
Yeah. It was the good news then, and it's the good news now.
Right? That human faculty, that conscience, what are some ways that you feel individuals could try and strengthen their attention to utilizing it?
Well, one of the most profound ways is through meditation. Meditation. Now, I ask people, how often do you meditate? And people rarely say every day, but that's the truth. Anytime we experience anything that we believe we love, we are meditating. It's a form of meditation. So meditation really is just the one pointed direction of our mental energy toward one object to the exclusion of others. One pointed attention at one object to the exclusion of others. That's the point of genius and creativity, which flies in the face, doesn't it? And butts up against multitasking, which is the culture's response, which there isn't anybody who believes it's possible to multitask. It's not possible to multitask, right? We have our child, humanity's child, the computer, can only do one thing at a time. It's always 1 or 0, 1 or 0. Mm-hmm. So meditation helps to train the mind to be one-pointed. And in that one-pointed attention, automatically there is created a space between stimulus and response. Mm-hmm. So if I'm meditating on a mantra or my breath with one-pointed attention and a distracting thought comes, mm-hmm. If I am learning to be one-pointed, there will be a space between stimulus and response. And what's in that space between stimulus and response? My freedom of action, to act skillfully. So in that space between stimulus and response, which comes as a byproduct of learning how to focus my mind, in that space, I have the freedom to check with the conscience, to determine whether this distraction is legitimate or it should be sacrificed back to the origin from which it came. And if I do that on a regular basis, two things will also happen. Number one, I will be creating muscles of willpower to do what's to be done, when it's to be done, and what's not to be done, not to be done, when it's not to be done. And also because I'll always be consulting with my conscience, I expand my creativity of possibilities. And that practice, and it doesn't take a lot of time. I say start with 60 seconds. 60 seconds. Even if people just sit quietly for 60 seconds and bring their attention to the breath at the bridge between the two nostrils and become aware of the inhalation and the exhalation, the inhalation and the exhalation for 60 seconds. That's all it takes. You will begin to create one-pointed attention, increase the space between stimulus and response, gain the freedom to counsel within to your conscience and the superconscious portion of the mind, become more creative, and build the muscles of willpower. And all of those skills can then be used with every single relationship that we have. Those are like the tools that we learned in scouting when we were little kids.
I love that. It's so true. If we're not able to focus, right, most folks will go into this fight or flight or freeze pattern.
Right.
And so then we're super reactionary.
That's right.
And then go back into that reptilian portion of our brain, which then causes more suffering, conflict, etc.
Yes. And that inner conflict that is so prevalent becomes the mother of all problems. If there's conflict in the mind, there has to be conflict outside the mind. That means first the body, and then interpersonal relationships, and relationships with minerals, animals, the entire universe.
Absolutely. There's that relativity there with whom we are and what we are in our surroundings. If we're all one, if we're all this one beautiful consciousness trying to just find our way.
That's right. So what that means, what you've just said, is very, very, very important and profound, because it means that every relationship that we have is with ourselves.
Mm-hmm.
That's why Jesus says, love thy neighbor as thyself.
Absolutely.
Not because it's a cool idea, but because on the highest level of consciousness, our neighbor is ourself, pure consciousness, having a human experience. Even though the neighbor has a different body, has a different mind, has a different habit pattern, a different personality, all of those are subject to change. Right. But there's something that never changes within each of us: pure consciousness, awareness, wisdom, bliss, and fullness. So through our meditation, daily meditation, we come to realize we are citizens of two worlds simultaneously. We are essentially spirit, eternal beings, pure consciousness, wisdom, bliss, and fullness, having a human experience in time and space through a mind, body, sense complex.
You had started the American Meditation Institute late 90s?
96.
96. Did you ever imagine that the world we're in now, this future, because I feel like society as a whole is a lot more welcoming on a popular cultural side of things, are far more accepting of meditation today. Did you ever see it shifting, and Was that a hope of yours? What were your feelings then when you first started the American Meditation Institute?
Well, I don't mean to be disappointing, but I didn't, I had no vision, and I had no desire other than to be in service, as was instructed by my teacher. So one day I received a letter from my teacher who was living in India, and I knew that he was sick, but I didn't know how sick he was. But it was a note, and he always wrote in little cryptic ways, didn't take many words. This letter consisted of 3 words, and it was "Start teaching now." So right away, the insecurities of the personality went to work. Oh my gosh, what am I going to teach? Where am I going to teach? How am I going to teach it? To whom am I going to teach it? And so after I calmed the personality down a little bit, I realized, after contemplating, the only thing that I was qualified to teach was what I practiced. That's the only thing that was real and truthful to me, was what I experienced and what I practiced through my own experimentation process. And that's what I just started doing, Jay. I just started sharing what I do every day. And that just took on a life of its own. And we wanted to name the institution properly, so that people would know that this is not some kind of foreign entity or philosophy, but no, this was the American Meditation Institute. Yes, the seeds were planted in our consciousness, many of them from experiences people had in other places, other countries, but they're filtered through our American experience. And that's unique. And we wanted to share that uniqueness. We're very practical people, Americans. It takes us a while to get going, but once we see a mission, we galvanize a tremendous amount of creative energy with great purpose. So, starting then and through and including today, my challenge is to remain in the present moment, to bring yesterday and tomorrow into today, and bring today into now. And being centered in the present moment now. Counsel with the conscience to determine what's to be done and what's not to be done. And that led me to this conversation with you, Jay. It's very cool.
It is. I love that. It's just this wonderful journey that
is being lived through us.
Yeah.
We're not the doer.
No, by no means are we. You wrote another book, The Heart and Science of Yoga.
Yes.
And you touched upon some concepts in our conversation today so far that you brought up in that book, and I feel like at the time when when you release a book, and part of my ignorance, that was the first book of yours that I learned about. Was that your first book?
Yes. Actually, it was. Well, when I received that note from Swami Rama, my meditation master, I sat down at a computer. It was the first time I ever owned a computer. And I didn't even know how to operate a computer. And I'm not a techie, but I forced myself. I got some tapes, and they were available at the time, and I learned how to use it. And I just sat for several weeks pouring out what I practiced so that I would know what it was I was going to teach. That became handouts that I gave to students originally. And that became the outline and the skeleton eventually for the book, The Heart and Science of Yoga.
An undertaking in and of itself, how overwhelming that must have been. But the fact that you
Well,
felt
not really. I was just sort of, I was playing the secretary. I was just taking notes on what was,
Okay.
what was he doing? When does he do this? Why does he do it? What kind of experiments does he do?
Okay.
I was interrogating myself. I was the reporter, and I was the subject of the report.
Wow. You felt it came naturally to be able to do that. When you give that perspective, that seems logical.
Yes, because as a matter of fact, and life has its strange ways of providing us everything we need. So before I really immersed myself in the perennial philosophy and perennial psychology and yoga science, I started a newspaper, an alternative newspaper in the early 1970s. And that taught me how to be a reporter. I didn't realize at the time that I was preparing for something else. But all these people came to me to teach me on how to be a reporter, how to present news to people. It's very interesting.
Wow.
And fortunately, they were wonderful teachers, and I was a good student. I was just soaking it up. I had a fantasy when I was a kid. When other boys, mostly boys, were enthralled with the television show called Superman, some of them would tie a towel around their neck and jump out the window, thinking that they would be able to fly.
Oh dear.
A lot of kids got injured.
Yeah.
Or worse. Anyway, the Superman character did not hold that much appeal to me, but Clark Kent, his boss at the Daily Planet newspaper, he was very interesting to me. The publisher and the editor of the Daily Planet. Now, that's something that I would like to do, I said to myself. I'd like to have a newspaper. So in 1971, I started a newspaper called the Washington Park Spirit. Washington Park in Albany, where I was living at the time, that park was situated in the center of the town, and it was at a time where there was a lot of urban redevelopment, where urban homesteading, people would be coming back into the city, young people, similar to what happened in Brooklyn, outside of New York, during around the same time. And it was thrilling. But it taught me how to be a good reporter. And I've used that ever since.
Funny how that works.
Yeah.
It's
It's marvelous.
All these breadcrumbs left behind. Just follow the
Right.
trail.
That's right. Oh, the magic brick, the yellow brick road.
Yeah. And how much of that, a portion of that, or all of that, is just following and listening to your conscience?
Yes. That's what it's all about. That's what it's all about. And that takes a tremendous amount of pressure off of us. And it provides us a tremendous amount of energy and creativity. I remember a wonderful quote from Gandhi. There was a New York Times reporter, I believe, who asked him in India during the time of the struggle for liberation from the world's greatest military force, Great Britain at the time. And the reporter asked Gandhi, gosh, you work so hard. You work 14, 18-hour days, day in, day out. Don't you ever want to go on a vacation? And Gandhi's reply was, I'm always on vacation.
Mm-hmm.
I like that. That's something that I'd like to learn how to do.
Same.
That's what I said to myself. And I consider myself every day as a day of vacation. Are there challenges? You bet. You bet. But the more that we're in service to the superconscious wisdom reflected by the conscience, we get this instruction on what's to be done and what's not to be done. And we know that it's not about accomplishment. It's about intention to be one rather than two. Because when there's a space between the two, that invites fear. And fear always invites danger. Not so when there's only one. Because when there's only one, and every relationship is with yourself, what is there to fear? And whom is there to fear if there's only one?
Such a profound perspective on that as well. I love that.
I love it myself.
What are some things you have coming up? Anything coming up at the Institute? I know January, you are the founder of the National Consciousness Month?
National Conscience Month.
Oh, Conscience. I'm sorry. Pardon me. National Conscience Month.
Yeah. January. This is our third annual. It's an idea that had been percolating for about 15 years. And 3 years ago, I decided I just have to do something. Mm-hmm. And so we started, and this is the third annual, and it's growing. And it's just an opportunity for people to begin conversations just like you and I are having, and to begin experimenting with the conscience as our guide. Yeah. So that's happening the whole month. We have a marvelous essay contest for high school seniors. We're offering them a $2,000 scholarship for higher education.
Nice.
All they have to do is write the best essay on having used the conscience or having forsaken the conscience, and what did they learn from either experience. And that's still going on. And everything that you've heard from me today is contained in what we refer to as my foundation course. It's a 6-week course where I teach people everything that I've learned and have experimented with that is contained in that original text, The Heart and Science of Yoga. That is the curriculum, which came from my personal practice. So the foundation course can be found at our website, which is American Meditation
That's wonderful. And now there's a lot of different programs that you have going on. If one peruses the site, there's things going on throughout the year. There are
Yes.
classes. What are some things coming up between now and the spring that some folks could maybe look into?
Well, every year I do an in-depth study of the chakra system. That will be happening, I believe, in February.
Awesome.
And anybody who's serious about meditation and well-being should have a very in-depth understanding of the chakra system, because the chakra system, this subtle energy, these subtle energy forces contain each of these chakras, these major chakras, is a psychological center, such as groundedness, fluidity, energy, inclusion, having the capacity to see the truth and hear the truth and speak the truth and be united with the truth. So that's coming up, I believe, in February, and you'll be able to find it on the website. And also for people who just want to get started, put a toe in the water. Every Sunday from 9:30 to 11 Eastern Time in the morning, I do a guided meditation for people, and we have a philosophical conversation, not unlike what you and I have shared today, Jay.
Right on.
And it's free, and it's an hour and a half, and the next day, everybody receives a recording so that they can use that during the week. It's very helpful.
That's great.
Yeah. And both are free. The meditation is free. The what we call the satsang, the company of truth, that philosophical conversation is free, as well as the recording.
Wow, that is great. You're doing a lot of wonderful things for this world, and I truly, as a human being, can't thank you enough for just sharing your love and just doing what you do sincerely.
Well, I do believe in my heart that it's contagious. So if I'm planting seeds and I'm singing the song of the truth as best I can understand it, there is going to be an ear to hear and an eye to see. Might it be just needles in haystacks? Doesn't matter. Because the more each of us can purify our own instrument, each of us is in the process of purifying consciousness. And when we purify the consciousness that is within us, that is us, let go of faulty concepts, we change the consciousness of the planet.
Oh, I love that. Leonard, thank you so much from all of my heart and all of my being for doing this with me today. I really, truly appreciate you on so many levels.
So I just want to share an interesting story that came to mind. When Swami Rama came to the West from India, he sat next to a Japanese man, and the Japanese man said, if you'd like, I know that, since having conversation with you, you're not from, the country. If you'd like, I could help you. And Swami Rama said to him, no, I'm waiting for a friend to come along and be with, and that person will be helping me. So anyway, to make a long story short, after the plane landed, and they rendezvoused again at the baggage pickup, and the Japanese man came up to Swami Rama, my meditation master, and said, You have seem to have a lot of baggage. Can I help you with that? And Swami Ram said, I think you are my friend. You are the friend that I have been waiting for. So I bring that up because I'll say to you, Jay, thank you for this invitation, because you have introduced me to my friend. That would be you. And I look forward to exploring that relationship.
Likewise.
Thank you. God bless you.
God bless you too. Thank
bless
you so much for this. Leonard, I hope we can do this again sometime.
Well, I always consider hope a bankrupt concept. Because hope always contains a fear that it might not come about.
Well, then let's do this again sometime. And there you have it. I absolutely loved that conversation with Leonard. I really enjoyed how Leonard talked about the importance of having a philosophy of life which can guide us through our ever-changing lives, and how we can be prepared. I really loved that. We talked about Leonard's newest book, Your Conscience, which is absolutely amazing and highly recommended, as well as his other book, The Heart and Science of Yoga. We learned about how Leonard founded the National Conscience Month, where in January they do an essay contest for high school seniors for scholarships for higher education. I think it's wonderful that Leonard is giving back to the community. We learned about all the wonderful courses and classes they're presenting through his website, which is AmericanMeditation.org. So be sure to check that out, where they offer a free guided meditation and philosophical conversation. And that's every Sunday, 9:30 to 11 Eastern Standard Time. So be sure to check out AmericanMeditation.org for more information. And you can find Leonard and the American Meditation Institute on Instagram at American_Meditation_Institute. Be sure to give them a follow and check that out. It's been wonderful learning about so many wonderful things that we can apply to our daily lives. And I can align with Ram Lev on the inspiration on spreading those seeds and just helping others. And if you're looking to find us on Instagram, you can find us at itd.jcosta, as well as on Twitter at itd_jcosta. I can't thank you enough for joining me on this journey. And until next time, take care of one another and keep thinking for yourself.